Welcome to a battle not of soundbites, but of substance, not of political parties, but of legal philosophies. Tonight, we enter the bright, cold arena of a national television studio to witness an intellectual duel of the highest order. In one corner stands a titan of the law, a Harvard law professor emeritus who has shaped legal discourse for half a century. A man whose name is synonymous with courtroom drama and constitutional authority. In the other, a rising star in Congress, a former public defender and civil rights attorney whose expertise was forged not in the ivory tower, but in the trenches of the justice system, fighting for the very people the law so often overlooks. What unfolded on the set of CNN was more than a debate about voting rights. It was a generational and ideological clash over the very meaning of expertise, experience, and the right to interpret the Constitution itself. One came armed with a formidable reputation, the other, with meticulous preparation and the quiet confidence of a warrior who has been underestimated her entire life. It was a confrontation that would prove, in stunning fashion, that in the arena of ideas, a well-read mind is always more dangerous than a well-known name. The CNN studio buzzed with the low, electric hum of anticipation. Moments before the broadcast went live, Alan Dershowitz, the 85-year-old Harvard law professor emeritus and a lion of the American legal establishment, stepped out from backstage. He clutched a thick stack of papers, his expression firm with the unshakable intent of a man who has argued and won before the Supreme Court. "I've got the evidence that will expose the Congresswoman's lack of legal understanding," Dershowitz declared to the moderator, his voice steady and resonant. "She might be a rising star in her party, but tonight, your viewers will see that she is far out of her depth." He settled into his chair, a figure of crisp navy suits and institutional prestige. At 85, he carried the full weight of his legacy, having taught generations of the nation's top lawyers and defended a litany of high-profile clients from O.J. Simpson to Jeffrey Epstein. His confidence was palpable. He had not come to discuss, but to dominate. Across the table, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of Texas watched him, her expression poised, a faint, knowing smile on her face. At 43, the Yale-educated attorney and former public defender was a relative newcomer to the national stage, having served in Congress for only 2 years. To Dershowitz, she was a novice, but those who knew her recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same quiet confidence she had displayed in Texas courtrooms, just before systematically dismantling an overconfident prosecutor's case. She had prepared for this confrontation in excruciating detail. What Dershowitz saw as an easy win, she saw as an opportunity. As the cameras began rolling, the two legal minds locked eyes in an intense stare-down. The veteran scholar was about to learn that underestimating Jasmine Crockett would be the biggest mistake of his televised career. The host, Rebecca Mitchell, opened the discussion. "Tonight, we're joined by two legal experts to debate the Voting Rights Protection Act. Professor Alan Dershowitz and Texas Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett." Dershowitz, leaning into his microphone, began with a clear act of condescension. "Thank you for having me, Rebecca. I've been teaching constitutional law since before the Congresswoman was born. I think the public deserves to hear from someone who actually understands the legal complexities involved." He shuffled his papers, props meant to signal his deep scholarship. Crockett, composed in her maroon suit, did not flinch. "Good evening," she said evenly, her voice carrying a trace of her Texas roots. "Unlike some, I'm not here to lecture Americans from an ivory tower. I'm here to talk about legislation that impacts real voters, people I've represented both in court and now in Congress." The battle lines were drawn. Rebecca Mitchell turned to the substance. "Professor Dershowitz, you've called this bill an unconstitutional overreach. Why?" Before Crockett could be offered a chance to speak, Dershowitz jumped in. "What's at stake is nothing less than the constitutional balance of power," he asserted. "The Congresswoman and her colleagues want federal control over what the Constitution clearly reserves for the states. This isn't just poor policy, it's flagrantly unconstitutional. I'm surprised anyone with a law degree would support it." The camera caught Crockett's faint smile. It was not a smile of amusement, but of recognition. This was exactly what her team had prepared her for. They had analyzed Dershowitz's debate style for weeks, his tendency to interrupt, to assert intellectual superiority, and to sidestep opposing arguments by dismissing the expertise of his opponent. But Crockett had a secret weapon. She had spent her weekend not just reading the bill, but reading Dershowitz's own past writings, essays and books from the 1970s and 1980s that she had discovered directly contradicted the very positions he was now so arrogantly asserting. "Congresswoman," the host turned to her. "Your response to the professor's constitutional concerns?" Crockett straightened her papers. "I'd be glad to address those points. But first, viewers should understand something essential. Interpreting the Constitution isn't reserved for Ivy League professors. It belongs to every American." Dershowitz raised an eyebrow, about to interrupt, but she pressed on. "The professor implies I misunderstand the law. Let's address that. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution clearly grants Congress authority over the manner of holding federal elections. The 14th and 15th Amendments further empower Congress to enact legislation to safeguard voting rights. This isn't advanced legal theory. It's the plain text of the law." Dershowitz shook his head, visibly irritated. "Congresswoman, I'm fully aware of those provisions. But the Supreme Court has repeatedly affirmed state authority in election administration. Most notably in Shelby County versus Holder." "I'm quite familiar with Shelby County," Crockett replied coolly, "having litigated voting rights cases that were directly impacted by it. The question isn't whether states have any authority. It's whether that authority can be used to unconstitutionally silence the voices of their own citizens. That is precisely the kind of emotional argument that clouds this debate." Dershowitz scoffed. Rebecca interjected, trying to ground the conversation. "Let's focus on a specific. Professor, you've criticized the requirement for a minimum number of early voting days. This is a classic example of federal overreach," Dershowitz said, leaning forward. "States differ in population and resources. A uniform, one-size-fits-all federal rule ignores these realities and violates the core principles of federalism. The Congresswoman is pushing ideology over practicality." Crockett waited patiently for him to finish. "It's interesting you mention practicality. Professor," she began, her tone even, "because I have statements from election administrators in 23 states, including Republicans, who support these minimum standards as both achievable and essential for a functioning democracy." She then turned to face him directly, her eyes sharp. "But let's talk about consistency. In your 1982 book, Rights of the People, you argued, and I quote, that uniform federal voting standards, including national early voting requirements, may be a necessary check on states that show an ongoing pattern of discrimination or failure. Has the Constitution changed so much since 1982, Professor, or has just your political stance on it?" The camera caught the brief, unmistakable flash of surprise on Alan Dershowitz's face. He had not expected her to come armed with his own words. The studio was electric with a silence that was louder than any applause. Alan Dershowitz, a man accustomed to holding court, had been momentarily silenced by a ghost from his own past, summoned by the very person he had intended to dismiss. He shuffled the papers on his desk, a rustling sound that betrayed his momentary discomposure. "Academic thought," he began, his voice a touch too sharp, "evolves with evidence. Congresswoman, the voting landscape has changed considerably since the 1980s. My earlier position reflected the specific concerns of that particular time. It was a classic, professorial parry, an attempt to frame his changed position not as a contradiction, but as intellectual growth. But Crockett did not let him escape so easily. "So, constitutional principles shift with the political climate?" she asked, her voice laced with a sharp, Socratic irony. "An interesting theory, Professor, particularly for someone who so often claims to be an originalist." Before Dershowitz could respond to the charge of ideological inconsistency, the moderator, Rebecca Mitchell, skillfully intervened, pivoting to the next flashpoint. "Let's discuss voter ID laws. Professor, critics of this bill, including yourself, argue that it weakens election integrity." Sensing an opportunity to get back on solid ground, Dershowitz leaned forward, reclaiming his authoritative tone. "Those critics are correct. This bill is a solution in search of a problem. Multiple studies have shown that voter impersonation fraud, the only kind of fraud that voter ID laws prevent, is nearly non-existent." He scoffed. A dismissive, airy sound. Frankly, the argument that millions of Americans are incapable of obtaining a valid ID is an insult to the intelligence of the voters themselves. The Brennan Center, which the Congresswoman is fond of citing, is hardly an impartial source on this matter. Crockett's calm expression hardened slightly. Professor, she began, her tone shifting from debating an equal to cross-examining a witness. Have you ever personally represented someone who lost their right to vote because they couldn't afford the $25 for a certified copy of their out-of-state birth certificate? I have. Dershowitz opened his mouth, but she continued, her words a rapid-fire succession of real-world examples. Have you ever met an elderly citizen, born at home in the rural South in the 1930s, who has no official birth certificate to begin with? I have. Have you spoken to a low-wage, single mother who works 2 jobs and cannot take an unpaid day off to travel 2 hours to a state ID office that is only open from 9 to 5 on weekdays? I have. She looked at him, and her voice was a quiet indictment. Calling these real, tangible barriers an insult to voters' intelligence demonstrates exactly the ivory tower problem I mentioned earlier. These are not anecdotes, Professor. They are the lived realities that your abstract theories conveniently ignore. Sensing he was losing ground, Dershowitz retreated to the seemingly safe territory of legal precedent. Your anecdotes, while compelling, do not override a state's authority to protect the integrity of its elections. The Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld reasonable voter ID laws. Then let's talk about that. Crockett countered instantly, demonstrating she was just as comfortable on his chosen terrain. In Crawford versus Marion County, the case that upheld Indiana's voter ID law, the court specifically noted that the evidence presented of an actual burden on voters was limited. The ruling itself implies that where there is strong evidence of disenfranchisement, the constitutional test changes. She lifted another document from her stack. And since you are so fond of citing precedent, let's cite your own. In your 2005 article for the Harvard Law Review, you sharply criticized judges who, and I quote, hide their partisan policy motives behind selective and inconsistent constitutional readings. You went on to cite, as a prime example, state voter ID laws that are justified by baseless claims of fraud but are actually designed for partisan gain. You're taking that completely out of context. Dershowitz snapped, his composure finally beginning to crack, his face flushing with irritation. Am I? Crockett raised an eyebrow, a gesture of cool, confident challenge. She held the printed article in her hand. Would you like me to read the full paragraph into the record? Rebecca Mitchell, seeing the exchange had reached a boiling point, quickly intervened. We need to take a short break. When we return, we will continue our discussion on the Voting Rights Protection Act. As the camera lights dimmed, Dershowitz leaned toward his aide, his voice a low, urgent whisper, pointing furiously at his notes. Something had clearly gone terribly wrong with his preparation. Across the table, Crockett calmly took a sip of water. A producer approached and asked if she needed anything. I'm fine, she said evenly, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. But you might want to check on the professor. We haven't even gotten to the real contradictions yet. When the broadcast resumed, the energy in the studio had fundamentally shifted. Alan Dershowitz looked composed, but the easy, dismissive confidence he had projected at the start of the debate was gone. Replaced by a firm, defensive posture, he had used the break not to reflect, but to reload, and he came back with an attack aimed directly at Crockett's authority. During the break, he began, facing Crockett directly. I reviewed my own writings, not the Congresswoman's selective quotes. My position has always been that election laws must strike a balance between access and integrity. But since we're discussing credentials, let's be clear. I have argued over 50 cases before the Supreme Court. I have taught constitutional law to thousands of this nation's top attorneys for nearly half a century. With all due respect, your brief tenure as a state legislator and a first-term congresswoman hardly qualifies you to lecture me on constitutional interpretation. It was a classic appeal to authority, an attempt to end the substantive debate by disqualifying his opponent. Viewers could see the condescension in his tone, but Crockett had been waiting for this exact moment. Professor, she began, her voice calm but precise, the same tone she would use in court when an opposing lawyer had just made a critical Unforced error. I think it's time we address the elephant in the room. The issue, she continued, her voice as steady as steel, is that you are relying on your credentials instead of engaging with the core of my arguments. That strategy might work in a classroom where students are worried about their grades. But this isn't Harvard Law, and I am not your student. Dershowitz's expression tightened. I am addressing the substance. He replied curtly, you're the one bringing up old, irrelevant quotes. I'm pointing out a pattern of how your views have conveniently shifted over time. Crockett countered, but let's focus on today. You claim states should have broad, almost unchecked authority over their election procedures. Yet in December of 2020, you were on television arguing that state legislatures weren't even bound by their own state constitutions when appointing presidential electors. That legal stance, had it been adopted, would have canceled the votes of millions of Americans. She held up a new paper. You wrote, and I quote, the Constitution gives this power specifically to state legislatures, not to states generally. How do you reconcile that extreme position with your newfound concern for federalism and states' rights? Dershowitz shifted uneasily. That was a very narrow legal argument about the specific language of the Electors Clause, not about general election regulation. Is it? Crockett interjected, because both arguments deal with the same fundamental constitutional principle, the balance of power in our elections. It seems your interpretation of that principle changes depending on which political side benefits. The audience murmured as Dershowitz flushed with anger. That's an absurd and baseless accusation. My positions are based on rigorous constitutional analysis, not politics. Then let's review that analysis, Crockett said, smoothly moving to her next point. You consistently cite Shelby County versus Holder as your reason for opposing federal oversight. But in that very ruling, Chief Justice Roberts explicitly reaffirmed Congress's authority to address voting discrimination. The court simply required Congress to use an updated formula based on current conditions. That is precisely what this bill does. She leaned forward, her voice filled with the passion of lived experience. The difference between us, Professor, is that I've actually represented the real voters impacted by Shelby County. I have seen polling places in minority neighborhoods shut down with no notice. I have seen voter rolls purged of tens of thousands of eligible minority voters. I have seen voter ID laws crafted with surgical precision to exclude specific communities. Constitutional theory meets real life in those moments, Professor, not in an academic debate. Sensing the turning point, the moderator turned to Dershowitz. Professor, your response? He composed himself, falling back on his initial argument. The Congresswoman's experiences are valid, but they do not override the Constitution. This bill exceeds congressional authority by micromanaging state procedures. Section 306 alone includes 42 detailed mandates on early voting hours and locations. That is not a standard, it is a federal takeover. Crockett smiled slightly, a glint of triumph in her eyes. I'm so glad you brought up Section 306, Professor, because it is modeled on a legislative proposal that you yourself supported in congressional testimony back in 1991. You described nearly identical measures as appropriately tailored federal actions that respect state authority while ensuring access to the ballot. The room went silent as Crockett displayed a copy of the transcript on the studio's monitor. The date was clear: House Judiciary Committee testimony, March 14, 1991. Would you like me to read your own words back to you, Professor? She asked. Dershowitz blinked rapidly, completely caught off guard. I would need to see the full context of that testimony. Of course, Crockett replied, sliding the document across the table toward him. Take all the time you need. As he read, the camera captured his expression shifting from confidence to confusion, to quiet, dawning dismay. The transcript confirmed exactly what she had said. He was trapped, once again, by the ghost of his own testimony. When the broadcast resumed, the energy had shifted irrevocably. Alan Dershowitz, his face a grim mask of composure, attempted to regain the offensive by once again attacking Crockett's qualifications. But since we're discussing credentials, he said, facing Crockett directly, let's be clear. I have argued over 50 cases before the Supreme Court. I have taught constitutional law to thousands of this nation's top attorneys. With all due respect, your brief tenure as a state legislator and first-term congresswoman hardly qualifies you to lecture me on constitutional interpretation. Crockett had been waiting for this. It was the last refuge of an academic who had lost the substantive argument. Professor, she began, her voice calm but precise. The issue is that you're relying on your credentials instead of engaging with the core of my argument. That might work in a classroom where students worry about their grades. But this isn't Harvard Law, and I'm not your student. Her words were a direct, public rejection of his intellectual hierarchy. She continued, you mentioned your Supreme Court experience. I respect that, but I've worked in the state courts where these voting rights issues directly affect people's lives. I've helped seniors reclaim their right to vote after being purged from the rolls. Constitutional theory meets real life in those cases. Professor, not in an abstract academic debate. Lifting the text of the bill, she added, this legislation doesn't federalize all elections, as you claim. It simply sets minimum standards to prevent the worst forms of voter suppression. States still retain broad flexibility. The moderator, sensing the turning point, turned to Dershowitz. Professor, your response? Dershowitz, now visibly unsettled, shuffled his papers, searching for a final, decisive line of attack. In a last-ditch effort to demonstrate his superior knowledge, he tried to pinpoint a specific technical flaw in the legislation. Congresswoman, he said, attempting to regain his authoritative tone, with all due respect, I don't think you understand the unintended consequences of this legislation. Section 502, for example, could actually weaken minority voting power in certain local elections. Crockett's faint, knowing smile returned. Professor, she said gently, I'm afraid that's incorrect. There is no Section 502 in this bill. It only contains 428 sections. The room went completely still. The statement was so simple, so factual, so utterly devastating. Dershowitz had just proven, on live national television, that he had not even fully read the legislation he was there to condemn as an expert. He hurriedly shuffled through his papers, his face flushing a deep crimson as he realized his catastrophic error. I apologize, he stammered, his voice quieter now. I meant Section 402. Crockett responded without missing a beat. Section 402 deals with the security standards for ballot drop boxes. Professor, it has nothing to do with minority vote dilution. Perhaps you're thinking of H.R. 2722 from the last Congress? That was a separate bill entirely. The moment was a knockout blow. It captured what had been unfolding all along, despite his credentials. Dershowitz had come to the debate unprepared, relying on talking points and his reputation. Crockett, in contrast, had displayed a deep and granular command of the bill she had helped draft. The moderator, sensing the kill, turned to Dershowitz. Professor, given the Congresswoman's clarifications, do you wish to revise your position on any aspects of the bill? His trademark confidence completely shattered. He replied, his voice barely a whisper. I still have broad constitutional concerns. But I acknowledge that some of my specific criticisms may have been based on outdated or incorrect information. I will need to review the text more closely. It was a full and total surrender. Crockett, in a final act of grace that cemented her victory, nodded. I appreciate that, Professor. I'd be happy to share a full analysis from my office showing how each section aligns with established constitutional precedent. Perhaps, in the end, we can agree on the fundamental goal of protecting every American's right to vote. Her composed and generous tone in the face of his collapse underscored the profound difference between the two. One, clinging to a reputation that had just been tarnished. The other, grounded in substance, preparation, and an unwavering focus on the issue at hand. As the discussion segment ended and the cameras turned off, it was evident to everyone in the studio that they had witnessed a defining moment, a tectonic shift in a national debate, where the authority of reputation had been decisively defeated by the power of expertise. The moment the segment ended and the bright studio lights dimmed, the contrast between the two combatants was stark. Alan Dershowitz sat slumped in his chair, the formidable armor of his reputation now visibly dented. He waved away the host's polite thank you, whispering urgently to his aide, who was frantically scrolling through his phone with a panicked expression. The air around them was thick with the bitter taste of defeat. Across the table, Jasmine Crockett was the picture of calm and grace. She thanked Rebecca Mitchell and the CNN crew, shaking hands with the producers who approached her, their faces alight with the thrill of having just produced a segment that they knew would dominate the news cycle for days. "Congresswoman," one of them said, "that was one of the most remarkable debates we've ever hosted." Crockett simply smiled. "I was just happy to have a substantive discussion about the law." But the discussion had already escaped the confines of the studio. In the digital world, it had become a firestorm. Before Dershowitz had even left the set, clips of the exchange were flooding social media. The most viral moment, by far, was Crockett's final, devastating rebuttal. The exchange was clipped and posted with titles like, "Crockett fact-checks Dershowitz into oblivion," and "Watch a Harvard law professor get schooled on a bill he didn't read." The clip of Crockett calmly stating, "Professor, I'm afraid that's incorrect. There is no Section 502 in this bill," hit over 1 million views on X, formerly Twitter, within the first hour. The hashtags #Crockett clapback and #Dershowitz wrong Section 502 began trending nationwide. A brutal, real-time verdict rendered by the court of public opinion. Commentators from across the political spectrum were forced to acknowledge the one-sided nature of the outcome. Conservative legal analyst Andrew McCarthy, a frequent critic of Democratic policy, tweeted, "Regardless of your stance on the bill, Crockett just gave a masterclass in preparation. Dershowitz brought generalities and his reputation. She brought specifics and the text. Substance defeated status. A lesson for all." That evening, the cable news shows amplified the narrative. MSNBC's Rachel Maddow opened her show with a wry smile. "We often talk about David and Goliath stories in politics," she began. "Tonight, on CNN, we witnessed the legal version of that. Only this time David didn't use a slingshot. He used the U.S. Constitution and a well-read copy of his opponent's own bill." In his Manhattan apartment, Alan Dershowitz faced one of the most significant public setbacks of his storied career. His phone buzzed endlessly with messages from colleagues, former students, and journalists seeking comment. He didn't answer. He was watching the replays, a grim expression on his face, seeing the moments where his condescension had been met with calm, where his authority had been dismantled by her preparation. At Harvard Law, internal message boards and alumni groups erupted with debate, with several prominent professors noting that Crockett had masterfully employed the very Socratic method that Dershowitz himself had championed for decades to challenge and expose weak arguments. By morning, recognizing the need for damage control, he released a public statement. "While I continue to hold constitutional concerns regarding federal election legislation, I recognize Congresswoman Crockett's strong command of the issue. Public discourse benefits from well-prepared advocates on every side." Though diplomatic, the statement was universally seen for what it was: a concession. For Jasmine Crockett, the aftermath was transformative. Her office was inundated with interview requests from every major network and newspaper. Her social media following tripled overnight. More importantly, the political calculus on Capitol Hill began to shift. House Democratic leaders, recognizing the new, powerful voice that had emerged, immediately invited her to lead a press conference on the Voting Rights Protection Act the next day. Even more consequentially, the phones in her legislative office began to ring. 3 moderate representatives, who had been on the fence about the bill, contacted her office directly to express their newfound support, citing her clear and compelling defense of its constitutionality. The momentum was unmistakable. A legislative effort that had been seen as a progressive pipe dream now appeared to have a real fighting chance, all because of one flawlessly executed debate. The intellectual duel had produced a tangible political result, proving that a well-made argument can be more powerful than any backroom deal. The initial shockwave had passed, but the deeper institutional and cultural impact was only just beginning to take shape. As the initial, frenetic 24-hour news cycle began to subside, the Crockett-Dershowitz exchange transitioned from a viral media moment into a subject of serious institutional analysis. The story moved from the fast-paced world of social media to the more deliberative forums of law schools, civil rights organizations, and the nation's most respected editorial pages. Across law blogs and academic forums, the debate was being dissected not as a political skirmish, but as a significant intellectual event. A prominent professor at Yale Law School wrote a widely circulated essay stating, "What Congresswoman Crockett demonstrated is that lived experience, when paired with rigorous legal scholarship, can produce a more accurate and persuasive constitutional interpretation than abstract theory alone." She did not reject theory, she enriched it with the facts of human consequence. Georgetown Law quickly announced a special panel discussion for the following month. Its title a direct reflection of the debate's impact: Credentials versus Substance, Rethinking Legal Authority in Public Discourse. The confrontation had become a case study. Civil rights organizations, which had been fighting a defensive battle over voting rights for years, seized the momentum. The NAACP and the Lawyers' Committee for Civil Rights Under Law issued joint statements praising Crockett's masterful and constitutionally sound defense of federal voting protections. They amplified her arguments, sending out fundraising emails and legal analyses that explained the 14th and 15th Amendments' enforcement clauses to a newly engaged public. In key states like Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona, local voting rights groups reported an unprecedented surge in volunteer sign-ups, with many new activists specifically citing Crockett's passionate and intellectually rigorous defense as their inspiration. Conservative media worked to redirect the narrative. On Fox News, hosts argued that Crockett's focus on the Section 502 inches gaffe was a clever debater's trick that didn't address Dershowitz's broader constitutional concerns about federalism. Yet, even within those circles, there was a grudging admission of her skill. He relied on his reputation while she relied on her preparation, acknowledged a former judge on one panel. In a substantive debate, preparation will win every time. Then, 3 days after the CNN segment, an unexpected development occurred, one that took Washington completely by surprise. Alan Dershowitz requested a private meeting with Congresswoman Crockett in her Capitol Hill office. He arrived alone, without cameras or staff. The formidable, almost arrogant persona from the television studio was gone. In its place was a more humble, reflective 85-year-old scholar. "Congresswoman," he began, his tone notably different from their on-air encounter. "I have, as I promised, reviewed the bill thoroughly. While I still hold concerns about certain specific provisions, I must admit that your constitutional reasoning regarding Congress's authority was largely sound." He paused, then added with a clear note of intellectual honesty, "And your point about the real-world impact was well taken. Theory without application holds little value." Crockett, gracious in victory, did not gloat. Instead, she saw an opportunity. "Professor," she said, "the public deserves to see that constitutional interpretation doesn't have to be a zero-sum partisan game. What if we were to co-author an op-ed? We could discuss our shared principles on the importance of voting rights, while honestly acknowledging our different approaches to achieving them." Dershowitz was taken aback by the offer. It was a politically savvy and profoundly generous gesture. After a long moment of reflection, he agreed. Their joint piece, published in the Washington Post the following week under the headline, "Finding Constitutional Common Ground on Voting Rights," went viral for an entirely different reason than their debate. It was a model of civil, substantive dialogue. It concluded with a sentence that seemed to encapsulate the entire saga: "When debate centers on substance over status, and on evidence over authority, democracy thrives." The unlikely alliance, born from a contentious television debate, had become a powerful symbol of the very principles Crockett had championed. For Jasmine Crockett, the debate with Dershowitz marked a pivotal moment, not just in her congressional career, but in her broader mission to elevate the substance of the nation's most critical issues. The weeks that followed the CNN appearance were a testament to the profound impact of her performance. She received invitations to speak at Harvard, Yale, and Howard law schools, the very epicenters of the legal establishment. Enrollment in voting rights law courses surged at universities nationwide the following semester, an academic ripple effect that professors dubbed the Crockett effect. Perhaps most meaningfully, her office received thousands of messages from young lawyers, law students, and especially women of color who saw her as a new kind of role model. "You showed us that we don't have to minimize our experiences or our identities to meet power on its own terms," wrote a second-year law student from Michigan. "You proved that our voices, backed by preparation, belong at the center of the debate. In Washington, the political effects continued to unfold. The conversation around the Voting Rights Protection Act had been fundamentally altered. No longer was it mired in abstract, partisan constitutional theory. Crockett had successfully reframed it as a practical, moral, and constitutionally sound necessity. In a remarkable development, 3 Republican senators, known as moderates but who had been publicly skeptical of the bill, reached out to her office to open a dialogue about a potential compromise on federal early voting standards. The shift was not lost on the Democratic leadership. At a Congressional Black Caucus meeting, the venerable Congressman James Clyburn approached her. "Jasmine," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his long experience, "you didn't just win a debate. You changed how this issue will be discussed from now on. You forced them to engage on the substance. That's how lasting change begins." 6 weeks later, in a moment that few political observers would have predicted before her viral takedown, a revised version of the Voting Rights Protection Act passed the House of Representatives with a surprising degree of bipartisan support. While its prospects in the Senate remained uncertain, the bill now had a momentum and a public profile that few had thought possible. Analysts across the political spectrum credited Crockett with single-handedly reshaping the public's understanding of both the constitutional and practical dimensions of voting rights. Reflecting on the whirlwind of the past few months with her staff, Crockett put the entire event into perspective. "This was never about embarrassing Professor Dershowitz," she said. "It was about ensuring that every American's right to participate in our democracy is protected, both through a sound interpretation of the Constitution and through an understanding of real-world practice. When legal theory is forced to confront lived experience, that's where justice truly begins." The Crockett-Dershowitz exchange would go on to be studied in communications, law, and political science programs for years to come, a clear and powerful example of how meticulous preparation, substantive expertise, and unwavering moral conviction can successfully challenge and defeat established authority. It served as a lasting reminder that in a healthy democracy, ideas must ultimately stand on their own merits, not on the reputation of the person presenting them. A new voice had permanently entered the national stage, proving that the strongest answer to attempted humiliation is not reciprocal anger, but unassailable preparation and the quiet courage to speak truth to power. Analysis: the triumph of substance over status. The televised debate between Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and Professor Alan Dershowitz serves as a powerful and instructive case study on the nature of authority, expertise, and persuasion in the modern media landscape. Crockett's decisive victory was not the result of a single, "gotcha" moment, but a systematic dismantling of her opponent's entire rhetorical framework. The outcome can be understood by analyzing 3 key strategic elements she employed. First and foremost was the weaponization of preparation. Dershowitz entered the debate relying on what had worked for him for decades: his formidable reputation, his Ivy League credentials, and his ability to project an aura of unassailable authority. He came prepared to discuss general constitutional theories but was clearly not deeply versed in the specific text of the bill itself. Crockett, anticipating this, did the opposite. She came armed not with her own reputation, but with Dershowitz's. Her meticulous research into his past writings, books, articles, and congressional testimony allowed her to expose his profound ideological inconsistencies. By quoting his own words back to him, she turned his long and storied career from a shield into a weapon against him. This demonstrated that in a substantive debate, deep, specific preparation will always defeat generalized, status-based authority. Second was the masterful use of the lived experience as expertise framework. While Dershowitz framed the debate in abstract, theoretical terms, federalism, constitutional balance, Crockett consistently grounded her arguments in the real-world consequences of the law. When he dismissed the difficulty of obtaining voter IDs as an insult to voters' intelligence, she did not counter with a competing theory. Instead, she shared her direct experience as a public defender representing elderly citizens without birth certificates and low-wage workers unable to get to the DMV. This tactic did 2 things. It painted Dershowitz as an out-of-touch, ivory tower academic, and it framed her own experience as a valid and essential form of expertise. She successfully argued that understanding the Constitution is not just about reading what the founders wrote, It's also about understanding how those words affect the lives of real people. Finally, Crockett's victory was cemented by her grace in the kill. After definitively proving Dershowitz had not even read the bill he was critiquing, the Section 502 inches error, she had a moment where she could have gloated or moved in for a final, humiliating blow. Instead, she chose to be gracious. She offered to share her analysis and then, in their private meeting, proposed a joint op-ed. This was a brilliant strategic move. It prevented her from looking like a partisan bully and elevated her above the fray. It allowed her to win the argument on substance while simultaneously claiming the moral high ground of seeking unity and common ground. It transformed a simple debate victory into a statement on a better, more substantive form of public discourse, cementing her reputation not just as a skilled debater, but as a genuine leader.